All right, let's start talking about thesis development. So thesis development is one of the criteria for your FRQs, which are the 3 written responses on your exam. And we'll kind of talk about what the different questions are. But let's begin by talking about the type of theses or the thesis statements that you will be expected to write. Now, the one that you are probably more familiar with is a persuasive thesis. So that'd be something like a research paper whenever you're trying to convince someone of something. The ACT uses that, and the SAT uses a persuasive type of thesis. And then also your argument FRQ, which is question number 3, and your synthesis, which is question number 1 on your AP test. So as you know from the past video, a thesis is your overall arching statement that you are trying to make. So a persuasive statement is just the type of thesis where you are convincing an audience of something given different sides to an issue. The other type that's a little bit less familiar is what's called an analytic thesis statement. The other type of writing for your guys' test is called rhetorical analysis. And what a rhetorical analysis is it will give you a passage and it is asking you to interpret what the author's purpose is and how they achieved it. So anytime we're doing an analytic thesis, that means that we are given a text and we are kind of analyzing the author's choices, things like that. So similarly, like a literary analysis would be like, how did John Steinbeck create blank theme in Of Mice and Men? So that's an example of analytic claims or theses because you are taking a text and analyzing how an author achieved something. So for our purposes, we have the 2 types, the persuasive thesis and the analytic thesis, which, like I said, is for your rhetorical analysis FRQ. So that said, within that, there's kind of 2 different formats when we're talking about how to write a thesis statement, okay? There's an open format, and then there is the closed format. So let's start with the closed format because I think that's what you are most familiar with. And that's because that is where you preview your main ideas. So an example of that would be Marilyn Monroe was widely known because of her interesting backstory, the controversy that followed her, and ultimately her mysterious death. In that one, I've laid out my argument by giving you a preview of the 3 topics or claims that I'm going to make within it. So a closed thesis is always going to have that preview of ideas. An open thesis is going to be a more general statement. So for that same example about Marilyn Monroe, it might be as simple as because controversy and mystery surrounded her life, Marilyn Monroe is still remembered today. In that example, I haven't kind of laid out those 3 main ideas about her childhood, controversy, and her death. Instead, I've just made a general statement about who she was and the fact that she was still well known. Now, between these, there's not really one that is expected of you. I think both work very well in many different contexts. And I have seen high-scoring essays that have used both an open format and a closed format. I do think that an open format, which doesn't have the preview, is a little bit better for time management or timed writing. Because if you have that closed preview at the beginning, sometimes we forget to go back if we ran out of time and change it if we didn't get to the 3rd piece of our preview. So that said, either way, either thesis can be very successful, but in a timed writing situation, an open thesis might be a little bit more successful. There's also this idea of a defensible thesis. So on your AP rubric, it asks, it'll give you a point out of all 6 just if you have a defensible thesis. If something is defensible, that means that I can stand up for it, that someone else might disagree with me, someone else might have a variation of the idea, but it is specific enough that I can make that as an argument. So, like I said, your AP rubric will give you no points, or it will give you 1 point for a thesis statement. And their big thing is if it is defensible. So let's talk about what defensible is, and then we can kind of simultaneously talk about what a defensible thesis isn't. The first thing is that a defensible thesis is very specific. So as we've been doing our reading unit, we've been talking about how you have to be very specific when we're talking about purpose of a text. And that is absolutely true when you are writing your rhetorical analysis. It is not good enough to say that Florence Kelly uses illustration to make her point. Something like make her point is too vague. So in this, on your AP exam, you wouldn't get the point because it's too vague. Now, if I were to say that Kelly is enlisting the help of working men, or something along those lines, it's going to be much more specific, and it's defensible because that's something that I took away from the text. To say that she's making her point is, I guess, redundant, or not really making any sort of argument, because any sort of text, there's an intention or a purpose. So I think the biggest difference between getting that defensible point is that it's specific. The next thing is something you don't want, so over on how you won't get a point, is a survey thesis. Now this is very relevant when we're talking about that synthesis question I mentioned, because what a synthesis is it's taking multiple perspectives and putting them together. However, if I just make a thesis that says something along the lines of, some people say this, while other people say this, I haven't made any argument. I've just kind of surveyed the conversation out there. And that is, like I said, very common issue with synthesis. But for those of you who have tried an ACT writing, same thing, because in that situation they present 3 perspectives, but if you just present some people think A, some people think B, some people think C, it's not defensible because they can't really argue with that because that's right on the piece of paper, okay? That can also sometimes be called just restating the task. So that's another issue, or I guess error that we don't want to make. And really that kind of relates again to just being specific. So a defensible thesis is specific. That makes it unique to your writing. Okay. Now let's talk about how you kind of go about establishing a line of reasoning. Now, line of reasoning is something we talked a little bit about when we were talking about reasoning and organization. And how we kind of broke it down is we talked about how you chunk a text, okay? So I think the most familiar line of reasoning that you guys have seen is, here's my thesis, and then I break it into what? Claim 1, or main body paragraph 1, claim 2, and claim 3. So this is your traditional 5-paragraph essay structure. It's tried and true. It works. I would recommend it for your FRQ writing as well. But when we're talking about establishing a line of reasoning, we're just kind of thinking about what are those chunks of my argument? What are those pieces that I'm going to put together? Another thing we want to talk about is how do we approach the question itself? So the topics that they have you write about for AP are intentionally pretty general in that you can have your own opinions about them, especially the argument one where you are asked to bring in your own evidence. But before you sit down and kind of develop a thesis, you really want to think about the issue at hand. For example, there's a synthesis prompt that asks, is college worth the money? Now, we can look at that a lot of ways. Obviously, we can look at it economically. Is it going to pay off to go to college? But we can also look at it from a lot of different angles. And a sophisticated paper takes the time to figure out what those alternate perspectives are. Okay, so I have an acronym to help you with that, and it is okay? So these are just kind of different contexts we can use to approach a question like our argument one, our synthesis one, and also when we're reading a passage for rhetorical analysis, we can kind of think about which approach was the writer of that passage taking. So the first one, the first P stands for pragmatic, which I think can be phrased a little bit easier just to say, to think about the logistics or the practicality of something. So there is an argument prompt that asks if students should have a class in creativity. A pragmatic argument for that would be that who is going to be qualified to teach that class? How are you going to fit it into a student's busy schedule? What kind of materials and curriculum can be used? Those are all really practical ways of thinking about the issue, and pragmatic is just another word for that. So those were examples of how I am thinking about a creativity class pragmatically. The next one is economically, and that's pretty simple because that's just money, right? How much is it going to cost? How is it going to create balance? How is it going to create imbalance? How is it going to benefit people? Anytime we're talking money, which is a very common way of approaching an issue, that would be looking at it economically. The next one is to think about it ethically. So, I think if you refer back to our Florence Kelly passage, she is approaching the issue of child labor with a lot of emphasis on the ethicality or the ethics of that practice. So for example, she talks about how while adults are home sleeping comfortable, these children are up all night working long hours and all that. That creates this like moral conflict with the audience, where the audience may have ethical issues with child labor. So that's another way of looking at any issue, really, and it's really just assessing the right and wrong of it before kind of jumping in on the topic. The next one is to think about it psychologically. I don't know if I spelled that right, don't judge me. But psychologically, so thinking about the effects it'll have on the individual and mental health. So using my example of a class in creativity again, if you think about that, you could talk about the amount of stress that creates on a student to be pressured into creating something when they're maybe not naturally a creative person. If I am looking at the issue that way from that individual and what effect it's going to have on them, I'm thinking about it psychologically. The last one is sociologically. And that, just like it sounds, is about society or societal impact. What impact is that going to have on people as a whole, okay? Now, this little acronym, PEEPS, is where I start to build my thesis, okay? If I'm looking at that creativity class prompt, then these are the pieces that I'm going to consider before I shape what my argument is. Now, these might become claims or those pieces in my lines of reasoning, or they might become my entire claim as well. I just wanted to show you this because I think sometimes we look at an issue from one of these angles, but if we can think about the issues from all 5 of these angles, we're probably going to create a paper that is more engaging and probably more comprehensive. And that way of building a thesis is going to not only get that thesis point, but it could create that mastery level thesis that we want to see. All right. Now, I'm just going to briefly go over the 3 types of questions. In my next video, I'm going to show some examples of how you break them down, how you create a thesis for each of them, but I want you to have a little overview of what each question is asking first so we're not too confused when we get to the next step. Like I said, question 1 is the synthesis. And what that one is it is a persuasive, so this is one of the persuasive ones, a persuasive essay where there are like 6 to 7 sources provided, but ultimately your argument is what matters most. So it's kind of like a research paper, except that they have already provided you with the different sources that you're going to use. So it has like a cover sheet where it gives you a little background. Here's the issue, here's kind of the argument surrounding it, and here's your list of sources. Then what you do is you go, well, first of all, create what your opinion is, and then go into those sources to see where you can find evidence that supports you, as well as evidence that you can counter in your essay. Question 2 then is the rhetorical analysis. And I will tell you right now, this is probably the most intimidating, but you get a passage, and I won't sugarcoat it. They're not easy passages. You've looked at 2 so far. One example is the Abigail Adams letter. Another example is the Florence Kelley letter. And as you saw in those, the vocabulary can be challenging. Just comprehending the passage can be difficult. But by applying those kind of annotation and critical reading skills we've been talking about so far to the passage, we're able to go through and analyze what they call the rhetorical strategies. And rhetorical strategies is just another word for modes of development that we talked about in the Analyzing Reasoning and Organization video. So kind of like we were talking about those assertions, where you have your actor, you have the mode of development, and the why. A rhetorical analysis just kind of goes further to explain each of those with some evidence from the passage and then that commentary piece. The final question is the argument, or the open response is what it's sometimes called. There are no sources provided. It is also persuasive. So this one is really dependent on your own knowledge and your own background, really. They are usually very general. Lots of times they'll give you a quote about something like the unknown, adversity, civil disobedience, and progress, and they'll ask you to kind of build an argument, either agreeing, disagreeing with it, but there's some variation on that question. I think the biggest challenge with that one is definitely being able to figure out those sources that you can use to make the argument, which we'll talk about as we get going too. But these are your 3 FRQ questions. You get 2 hours and 15 minutes to accomplish all 3 of these on test day. And this is kind of where the next step in this unit, as we're talking about evidence and commentary, we'll start practicing these different types of questions. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'd like to show you how I would go about analyzing each of the prompts, how from there I would go through and develop a thesis. So the next video that I'd like you to watch, and you should continue adding to your notes, is writing a thesis, because I will have another video available for you in which I model the different approaches.